All right, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame held their 36th annual induction ceremonies at the Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse in Cleveland, Ohio at the end of October, and music fans can catch that starting November 20th on HBO and HBO Max. And it was a good year for fans of classic rock, with the hall welcoming in Foo Fighters, Ozzy Osbourne guitarist Randy Rhoads, Todd Rundgren, Carole King, the Go-Go's, Kraftwerk, legendary sideman Billy Preston, and others. And I'm Matt Wardlaw. It was a great evening of music. UCR has extensive coverage of all the induction speeches and performances that you can check out on our website. UCR's Annie Zaleski is with me, and somehow we were able to get Jason Hanley from the Rock Hall to join us and take a look at some of the evening's highlights. He's also going to share some insights in regards to some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that goes on with putting this massive event together. And Jason, thanks for joining us to talk a bit of music. I just always feel it must be such a relief when you're on the other side of this week's worth of events here in Cleveland that lead up to the induction ceremonies.
Yeah, it totally is, right? I always feel like the week after inductions, I'm trying to get my brain to work again, and it's just kind of like mush up there from the whole experience, because many people may not realize some of the aspects of not only the induction ceremony, but particularly when it's in Cleveland, the week of programming we do. That's months of work for a lot of people on the team. So we've been thinking about these artists, this induction, the activities around it. Even some of us learning some of the music of the inductees. We performed at the museum, and it's awesome. I mean, there's always something about it. Usually for me, I don't have too much to do the night of the show, and I just like going and being in the audience and letting it wash over me. That's my moment where I want to be out there and be a fan of the evening and just take it in. And this year was an incredible ceremony. It was a lot getting here. I feel like, sort of the induction ceremony that in a weird way was 2 years in the making, from not having one last year in 2020, a live event, just the HBO show for those inductees. So it was an incredible night.
So to tell folks a bit more about what you do, you are if I have this correct, the Vice President of Education and Visitor Engagement. And according to what I'm reading here, it's your responsibility to make sure that every guest who engages with the Rock Hall learns its history, which I can vouch you do that, and they leave inspired. And you can explain more about what that means, but there's a couple things in your bio that I saw that I love that I was unfamiliar with. So you saw Elvis when you were 5, and you played CBGBs in the 90s. So could you share some details on both those things?
Those stats sound awesome when you read them like that, by the way, Matt.
They do, yeah.
So, yeah, I think the thing is, I've been at the Rock Hall just over 17 years now.
Yeah.
And like you said, the job as the VP of Education has grown over the years and includes fan engagement now. And it really is literally to the point where my job is to think about how we activate the space. There's great exhibits done by the curatorial team and, led by Waka Onwusa now. There's great stuff happening on the communication side and on the website. My job is to think about anybody who engages with the museum. How are they going to learn something in that experience? Whether it's coming into the building and walking through it, it might be programming or things that happen in conjunction with the exhibits, tried and true education, bringing kids in of all ages, really. We have education programs for toddlers, high school students, college classes, and even adult education. I know you guys come to some of the evening programs and other things we do occasionally at the museum, interviews with artists. And it's just such a passion for me. Like you said, my parents were both big, big music fans. My dad had sung in an a cappella group. Anybody interested in looking it up? If you look up the Islanders from New York, from Long Island, there's still some of their stuff out there on a cappella collections. My mom was a massive fan of music. They both had a big record collection, everything from Motown to Johnny Cash, the Eagles. And we would just listen to rock and roll in the house all the time. So they took me to see Elvis when I was 5 years old. And I don't remember the music or anything, but I remember the spectacle. I remember being a little kid, and after Also Sprach Zarathustra played, Elvis came out and the lights all went up, and my dad lifted me on his shoulders for the first song. And I just remember that sensation of that concert. It stuck with me my entire life. They also took me to see Johnny Cash. I joked, a few years back, we did our program at the Rock Hall, our Music Masters program, where we honored Johnny Cash. And I got to meet John Carter Cash, who's interestingly enough the same age that I am. And he and I had met each other out back of a Johnny Cash show in like 1979, We were both like, 9, 10 years old, which was pretty great. So, and then I played in CBGBs because I played in rock bands in New York, played in industrial groups and punk groups, and got to play CBGBs back in the day. It was great. I was on one of those shows. A couple of nights we had played there. Maybe a total I played there about maybe 6 or 7 times on shows where it was like just all night punk bands, right? You loaded in early in the day and you set your gear in there, and then you got your chance to play. It was usually like 2 in the morning or something like that. But we loved it. I mean, it was amazing. So now I get to bring that passion every day to the Rock Hall. Strangely enough, not to talk too long, but that awning from CBGBs, as you guys know, is hanging at the Rock Hall. And I just think every day how weird it is that I was there as a punk kid playing years ago, and now that awning is hanging in the building where I work in my career as to educate people about rock and roll. It's just the weirdest full circle for me.
It's funny. There's a couple things. One, it's like, and I think Annie can speak to this because I don't think I actually know like what her actual first concert was. Maybe I do. She probably told me. But what you said about going to see Elvis and Johnny Cash, like my parents took me to see the Oak Ridge Boys and Peter Paul and Mary, 2 different things from what you were just talking about. But like what jives about all that is like, it's such a formative thing that like forms us as music fans. And that certainly made me a total music nerd for life.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. I mean, there's so much about that. Annie, what was your early concerts? Do you remember?
So my first concert actually was REM and Luscious Jackson in Cleveland on the Monster tour. But my second concert was Metallica on the Load tour, same thing, with Corrosion of Conformity. And I waited in line for tickets and I was like so excited. And, and then I saw Radiohead at a high school auditorium. But yeah, I mean, like you all were talking about, there's just that passion, and there was something about it that just kind of overwhelmed your senses, and you're always kind of chasing that. You're like, that's why concerts are so great. And what, I think we all probably miss them over, the last couple of years, is that there's just something, that magic, that just, draws you in.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the first 2 shows I ever paid for myself, like bought a ticket, waited in line and went to, was Yes, 90125, and then I saw Depeche Mode just the year after that. So 2 good shows to pay for on my own when I got a little older, right?
See, I'm so jealous. Like, and I guess I can match that with one that's still pretty cool. It is cool, no doubt, because this guy was just in town here this past Saturday night. But Flowers in the Dirt tour at the old Cleveland Municipal Stadium, Paul McCartney. That's really kind of what I consider my first show. My dad and I went to that. Like, that was the one where it's like we bought the tickets, and that's an important thing. Like, versus those first 2 shows I talked about. Like you just said, Jason, that was the one where I said, Dad, I want to go to this show, and I'm going to get us some tickets. And it's like, here's this guy who at that point, I already was going, this guy's kind of old. I don't know how good this show's going to be or not be. But he came out and, of course, just played for, close to 3 hours. It was insane. And then you flash forward like a good, like at least 20 years, Annie and I saw him in Kansas City, like, I don't know, 2010, 2011. He's still playing for close to 3 hours. If not
crazy, right?
Insane. So, well, that is kind of a good segue, because I wanted to ask you both, like, from this most recent induction ceremony that we just wrapped, what were kind of your favorite moments of the night? Annie, I'll start with you.
Many, many highlights. I honestly loved the LL Cool J performance. I was blown away. I mean, I obviously grew up listening to LL Cool J. He was all over MTV and the radio, and I've seen him on the Grammys. And I honestly had no idea what a powerful performer he was. It was just he just commanded the stage. And so that was certainly a highlight. I'm a longtime Go-Go's fan, so also seeing the Go-Go's get in was actually really emotional for me. Like I got teary-eyed like watching them, and just because it was just so cool and so inspiring. They're just such a formative band. And also I like seeing Paul. I'm a Paul person. You're talking about the Beatles. I'm a Paul girl. But it was so cool seeing him, how you could, and obviously it was the end of the night, everyone was tired, but he got on stage with Foo Fighters. he was into it. By the end of the song, you could see how into it he was. He was really letting loose in a way he doesn't necessarily do solo sometimes. Like that was very evident. I thought that was just really cool to see, especially because he talked about in his speech discovering rock and roll and how he had that passion, and Dave Grohl had that passion too. And you could really kind of see that come through, I mean, decades later. And so that was also really special.
Yeah, Paul's catching some flack for his speech. And it's like what I loved about his speech, which is what I always love about Paul. Like it was so real, like it was so from the heart, and people can say what they want to say about it, but it's just like for anybody that's been a Beatles fan and a Paul fan all these years, like that speech was just completely legitimately Paul. Like he was not phoning it. It was a great speech.
Just like telling you how I feel.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, he's a guy. I'm a guy. We're both guys.
What about you, Jason? What were some of your favorite moments on the night?
Well, I'll probably agree here quite a bit with Annie in that I thought the end of the night with Paul coming out and playing with the Foo Fighters was just the coolest. And you sort of mentioned it too. Like I felt like he got into it to a point where suddenly he was like singing like he was in the Foo Fighters. Like there was a moment where he was singing Get Back towards the end. I was like, oh man, he's digging in here. Like he's really reaching for it. He's put a little growl in his voice. I thought that was amazing. And what a great way. I also, for me being a keyboard player, knowing that they did Get Back and thinking that Billy Preston had been inducted this year too. And that of course is the track that Billy played on and was even credited to the Beatles and Billy Preston. So I thought that was a really cool moment to have that in there. Also blown away by the LL Cool J set. I mean, he just really came ready to be inducted into the Rock Hall, and for years, Chuck D and I talk quite a bit. He's come to the museum a lot. He's a real good friend of the museum. He and I are both from Long Island, so we talk a lot. And for years, he's told me like LL has got to be in the Rock Hall. Like, he would say, even though Notorious B.I.G., Tupac, worthy, but like, where's LL? We got to find a way to get him in. And it was like LL brought the evidence to the concert that night. Like he was like, here's why, if you doubted it, here's why I'm getting in. And then have, J-Lo step up there and Eminem. I mean, it was just like an incredible evening. I'll tell you one for me, just even personally, that I thought was really touching was we had done some work with the Everly Brothers over the year. And to see Brandi Carlile get up and do that great rendition of an Everly Brothers song at the end of the In Memoriam section. I just thought it was really simple. It was very basic, but it was so touching just to hear that too as part of the ceremony. I thought that was a really it was quiet in a way, but sweet moment during the ceremony.
Yeah, was she? I don't recall. Was she part of the Music Masters tribute to the Everlys that you guys did a number of years?
She was
back?
not. We wanted to have her, and we were unable to get her that night. But obviously, she would have fit perfectly had she'd been there. And that was such a great night. I think that's why, for me, even personally, we had honored the Everly Brothers. It was right after Phil passed.
Yeah.
And then Don came that night, and famously, Graham Nash helped us get him on stage. We were prepared for it, but Graham Nash and Peter Asher, Graham Nash and Peter Asher got Don to perform at the end of that night. And for me, that was just such a highlight of some of the work I've done at the Rock Hall. So when Don passed, it really, I felt that. And then to see that night was just really cool to have that in the ceremony.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to reference that, because like I know that when we went to that, like that was a really moving moment seeing Don come out, because I think that we had even heard like going in, like, look, Don's not going to be on stage. And that's
right.
Like for people outside of Cleveland that haven't seen those shows, like that's like there have been so many of the great shows over the years. That's one that I think of. The one that I was thinking of as you were talking about it was the tribute to Les Paul. Like each of these where these things happen, like usually that's part of it, is that like we don't know if Les is going to come out, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing I'll throw in for our classic rock fans that was great about that Les Paul night was Slash was there. And you guys would have to understand the venue where this was held, but it's a very it's a very upper class venue, we'll say. Yeah. And Slash walks out. Of course, he's got the hat on, but he's got a cigarette. Yeah. And you can just only imagine that, like, there's got to be somebody in the theater, like, that runs the place that's going, oh my God, he's got a cigarette on our stage. It was so rock and roll. And it's like we see a lot of those moments, whether they're at those Music Masters things, you know, in similar events, or at a thing like the induction ceremonies. But that particular thing with Les Paul, there were a lot of good moments that night. You mentioned the tribute to Johnny Cash. There were a lot of good moments that night. Mike Ness from Social Distortion just came out and just killed it.
Slayed Ring of Fire that night. It was so good.
Yeah.
And it's funny too, you know, you mentioned like that people, we had told people that Don was not going to perform during that Everly Brothers. People often think that we work at the Rock Hall like we're just trying to like fake people out or cause problems. Like he literally wasn't going to play. It's true of the Jerry Lee Lewis one too, when Jerry Lee Lewis got up at the end of the night. And Aretha, all of them told us they weren't going to play. In a weird way, that's how you know when you're working at the Rock Hall that you've gotten your job right. When somebody like Aretha Franklin walks up and says like, hey, I'd like to go play at the piano. And you're like, let's do it. You know, we're ready to make it happen. But a lot of times those artists aren't sure that they want to get out there and do it. And they're so moved by the night and the music. They just want to get up on stage because music is their voice. That's, you know, you hear so many musicians in the speeches at things like the inductions. You know, they'll say, well, I don't know what to talk about, or I don't usually talk a lot. And it's true. They don't. They use their music as the way they communicate. So, you know, it's always a special moment when people get up. And for classic rock fans, that Les Paul one, we had Richie Sambora, Steve Lukather. You know, that night was just like a list of guitar mania. It was so cool to put that show together.
So as we've mentioned, like you're all over the place throughout the week of events that lead up to the inductions when they're here in Cleveland. And I'm sure that mixed in with that are some fun behind the scene moments where you get to interact with a particular artist or band. What was kind of your favorite moment in that category?
One was working with the Go-Go's.
Yeah.
The Go-Go's came over to the museum on Friday before the ceremony for a plaque dedication and event we did there. And I had a chance to sit down and actually talk to them a little bit backstage. And it was so cool. And this happens a decent amount of times at the Rock Hall. Like when artists come into the museum, I always say they become fans themselves. And they realize, like, when you take them up to the Hall of Fame gallery, which has Chuck Berry as the picture at the beginning, as he was our first inductee, and you're walking them along that wall to get to where the new plaque is, and they see, you know, Elvis Presley and the Police and, you know, the Talking Heads and like just one band after the other. And it was just so cool. The Go-Go's were so authentic and so real. They just were excited to be there. They were really honored. They were, you know, glad they were finally getting in. They talked a lot about their desire to get more women inducted, which, you know, is something we all support. And I think just having some great musicians like that to advocate for it will be really powerful. So that moment was really cool for me. I guess maybe two others. One was actually talking to Clarence Avant and his family a little bit. And I think I think Lionel Richie in the ceremony did a great job of talking, you know, kind of he had a funny speech, but between the film that we showed and Lionel Richie's speech, it really showed you're like, oh man, Clarence Avant worked with everybody, man, like everyone, you know. That was a really special moment, getting just, you know, I enjoy being near folks like that who had so much to do with the history of rock and roll and making sure that we talk about them in a way that many people don't realize the impact they've had. And then the last one I'll say had nothing to do with anybody who was on stage, but at one of the events at the Rock Hall, I mentioned him before, Chuck D was there, and I always talk with Chuck. And it was, you know, Chuck D, Sha Rock, who came and was in the audience that night. She was there, and then Scorpio, from another inductee from Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And then the Grandmaster Caz was there. Wow. And I suddenly realized, like, it just happened by accident. And I suddenly was in this group of like having a conversation. And I looked around and I was like, can I curse?
Yeah.
I was like, holy shit, I'm in the history of hip hop right here. I was like, whoa, this is amazing, you know? And it's moments like that happen around the Rock Hall inductions that are so special, because you just realize that none of those folks were going to be on stage. They were all just there because they wanted to be there for LL and Jay-Z and just to be there for the night, which was really, really cool.
Did it seem like there was more star power this year, just like in the audience? Like, I mean, there were people like Tom Hanks. Like, I was really surprised, like some of the folks that I heard that were in the audience.
Yeah. Tom Hanks usually comes almost every single year. He keeps it very on the down low,
Yeah.
but he loves it. You know, he comes in the audience a lot. Um, you know, Michael J. Fox often comes in the audience. I mean, it's just some of these people who just love rock and roll so much and they like being there for this ceremony. They don't even come and make a big deal of it. There's not like a lot of, you know, they don't put it on their social media. They just want to go and again kind of be fans for the evening. You know?
Yeah, yeah, and you mentioned the Go-Go's, and I wanted to mention this to Annie because, like, one of the things that I thought was cool about the Go-Go's getting in is that, like, as the three of us know, like, they're all like distinctly different and interesting personalities, and I feel like with particularly with the inductions, but also like on the Friday prior to, the day before the event when they were at the Rock Hall, I think that people really got a chance to kind of see the different sides of the Go-Go's that are present with each one of them.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been a Go-Go's fan for decades now, and I think I really, I mean, I love their speech, obviously, because Kathy's sentiment about, we need to get more women in. I was just like, yeah, that's awesome. But just, they're decidedly themselves everywhere they go, and it was, and when you have a group like that, and they're being recognized and saying, hey, you are being yourself. That's cool. This is awesome. That's a really powerful message, I think, for anyone. I mean, the fact that Gina got up there and swore, they were like, oh no, Jane was, swearing too, like, but it was, seeing people kind of being themselves and, doing their own thing, even their outfits were amazing and different, that's, I mean, that's rock and roll, but that's also just really, it's a real testament to, it bodes well, basically.
Jason, what do you know about them getting Patti Smith to induct Rundgren? Because that was awesome.
Wasn't that cool?
Yeah.
Man, that was so good. Patti Smith is just one of my favorites. She's such an incredible songwriter, lyricist. She's just such a great human being in general, right? And to have her get up there and talk about, Todd Rundgren and the work he did as a songwriter, as a musician, I think that was great. I was really glad that Patti filmed that. And it's something I thought I wasn't sure beforehand how that was going to work in the live event, having a number of people, Obama appeared by video, Patti Smith appeared by video. Who else? I'm even forgetting now. Pharrell, who inducted Kraftwerk.
Yeah.
I thought those played really well in the audience. I think that might be like a part of the pandemic world we've all lived in. We're like, oh, they're on television, but I get it. They're still real people. Like, we can watch that,
Yeah. Do you think like that the way that the Rock Hall had to do the inductions last year with like the video packages and stuff, did that have that kind of effect on this year's ceremonies?
100%. I think, obviously nobody more than me wanted to see Depeche Mode and Nine Inch Nails on stage in Cleveland. Annie, I know you did too.
No.
Come on, right? But I think the HBO broadcast that year was really good. And I think there's something about let's face it, the history and education about these artists that normally there was those clips before each induction, but they were more almost like press reels, right? Like quick shots and a little bit of history and this and that. These really, the one for the HBO special in 2020 was really well done. And I think we learned that works. Like, an audience is willing to sit and hear all that. It's funny, I was sitting, my wife was sitting next to me at the show. And, at one point I was like, oh, are these running a little long? I feel like maybe I know all this already. And she was like, no, this is awesome. Like, I didn't know that about Carole King. I was like, oh, okay, good. Well, then it's doing its job. So I think we're probably going to see more things like that in the future coming out from the Rock Hall and being part of the ceremony. And I think it played well in the arena. I don't know. I think it'll play even better on HBO when the broadcast comes out, right? Don't you guys think? Like, I think that stuff will tie together even more.
I mean, I was even thinking that how cool it would be, like, to even like put all of those videos together in like a separate package. Like, let's have a whatever hour and a half special, because they were so well done. And I know you're a Kraftwerk fan, so I'm going to mention this, that I actually particularly appreciated that one, because Kraftwerk, obviously Pharrell inducted them, but it got into so much of the depth and breadth of their impact from all of the synth pop acts. Like, of course, I was excited to see Human League and OMD.
New Order.
A New Order, and then they had the archival Bowie, and so Gary
Yeah.
Newman, so I was already happy. But then you got into showing their impact on hip hop, which a lot of people forget, or they in the early 80s, how instrumental Kraftwerk was, no pun intended, on hip hop. And so I really liked how you were able to really show, rather than saying, oh, have a voiceover explaining this, really show with footage and interviews and the actual archival footage. This is the impact. It made it more visceral, at least for me.
Yeah, I think too, you hit on something there too, Annie, like that idea that I think it's when people asked us like, why is a band like Kraftwerk going into this kind of influence category that's clearly broadened out from what was early influence, right? So Charlie Patton, early influence, but suddenly now you've got Kraftwerk in that category. And I think it's exactly what you just said. Like there are a lot of people who don't realize how influential Kraftwerk is to the history of popular music, right? Whether it's, as you mentioned, on hip hop, synth pop, even on just regular rock, on Bowie. And, when you've got them on a ballot, and people have got to look like, oh, Foo Fighters or Kraftwerk, I think I know who they are. Obviously, I'm a nut about Kraftwerk, as you mentioned, and I've been obsessed with them almost my entire life. But I think that's where that category is going to be really cool now, because you can get someone inducted like a Kraftwerk. And then if we can make that really cool educational piece in the ceremony, and suddenly people were like, whoa, oh, I didn't realize that. That's actually a good moment. Like I feel proud at that moment at the Rock Hall that we've been able to make that connection for somebody who didn't realize it beforehand.
So we might have covered this in broad strokes, but for you too, like what were your who were you happiest to see get the induction nod this year?
Annie, go ahead. What do you think?
Me, obviously I feel like I'm a broken record, but obviously the Go-Go's and Kraftwerk. But I was really and LL Cool J. Like I think I really agree what you said, Jason. I feel like LL was like, guess what? I deserve to be in here. I've been nominated how many times before? Here's the proof, boom, in a way. But I was really happy that Randy Rhoads too got that kind of acknowledgement, because I think, music fans and, metal fans, obviously it's like Randy Rhoads, like duh, of course. But, having that little bit extra, influence and just in all the guitarists that showed up to say, here's, Kirk Hammett saying, yeah, Metallica ripped off One. Here we go,
Right? Wasn't
really
that cool?
Showed, like, I had no idea Tom Morello named his kid after Randy Rhoads. I thought that was hilarious. I had no idea that he is just, and if you figure these are all the biggest rock guitarists of the 80s, 90s, and now. And so if you talk about impact as well, and he's not necessarily someone like, if you're talking about big rock guitarists, if you are a rock fan, obviously Randy's going to come up, but like for most people, he's not going to come up. And so I think that was also another really kind of cool angle, just saying, hey, guess what? This guy really is influential and here's why.
Yeah, that's a great point. I like too, for those us here in Cleveland, that famous Randy Rhoads tribute record, much of it recorded right here in Cleveland, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was just so happy to see Kraftwerk inducted. I've been advocating for them and talking about them for years, both within the Rock Hall and to anybody who would listen to me talk about them outside of it. I think I was also really happy to see Tina Turner inducted this year.
I can't believe I forgot that. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh my God.
Right? Like, I think that too, like, I think the induction of Whitney Houston last year and Tina Turner this year, it's starting to open up some areas for women, obviously, but also I think for like other types of pop and R&B sounds that we've not been great at. Everybody always talks about for years, it was why is it prog rock inducted? And again, I was hoping for that myself, but there's a lot of that really cool, pop and R&B from the 80s that I think deserves to be inducted. And I think Tina's solo induction opens up some of that too, which would be really cool to see more of it. And I think overall, like if you think about even all the artists we've talked about just now, that sort of real diversity is what I think, hope that the future continues to be. Because what a cool show. There was something for everybody. I think everyone learned something maybe about an artist they didn't know. There was something new in there. It was just a really cool induction ceremony. And I loved the way so many current artists, new artists even, were there sort of participating, because it gave you that fabric I always like to talk about, that rock and roll, it's not like it's frozen in amber. It's like exists over time, and artists go back to older artists and pull in new ideas. I thought that was a lot of fun.
And what I think about a lot, is that people forget that, I think rock and roll became, known as a certain thing. A lot of times, it was sort of artificially put together. Radio stations and record labels decided rock was one thing.
Yeah.
But if you think of the freeform radio stations in the late 60s and, even early 70s, they played everything. They would play
Everything,
R&B. They would
right.
play like the cool, underground funk. Parliament Funkadelic, Maggot Brain was huge in Cleveland,
Yeah.
and I think about that it's how things are evolving now is almost a throwback to that time a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation, right? And I think, even going all the way back to Alan Freed, who just played so many different sounds, R&B and blues and even jazzy stuff, like, and then there was this period where everybody assumed rock and roll was one strict thing. And just because LL Cool J got inducted doesn't mean you can't love Randy Rhoads and Iron Maiden someday, hopefully, too, right? I mean, all that stuff exists together somehow.
Yeah, the three of us here can help anybody that needs help loving Iron Maiden. We're here for you. So
yes, that's right.
now, a couple stray things. One, I thought the symbolism, which I don't think there was any connection here, but I just thought it was kind of cool that like 26 years after the Rock Hall opens its doors, the Foo Fighters go in 26 years after they started as a band. I thought that was just kind of a cool, like, numeric connection.
Yeah.
And then also how excited was Carole King and how humble and awesome was Carole King? Like, that was another cool moment of the night.
Because obviously she's Carole King. I mean, you just look at, here's the songs I wrote, like, oh
Yeah.
God. And then, but you think about like something like Tapestry, obviously was such a monster seller back in the 70s, but over time, it's really become this touchstone to so many younger artists and so many modern artists. I mean, Taylor Swift, obviously, who inducted her, is, so in the mold of Carole in terms of being an amazing artist and songwriter. But that's really, there's just so many younger female artists as well that do the same thing. Carole really opened a lot of doors in that sense, I think. And yeah, she was just so thrilled to be there. And that was like, my God, Jennifer Hudson was so amazing. Holy cow. I was just like jaw on the floor. I had to write about that. I'm like, how do you even describe that? That she was basically just like a mic drop. But but even showing too, like, Carole is just such a, wrote also such a diversity of songs. She wrote songs that people have covered in so many different ways, besides just being an amazing, and she's still co-writing. She co-wrote a song with Jennifer for the Aretha biopic, like,
right.
Amazing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I loved Taylor Swift opening. It was almost like a kind of minimalist synth poppy version of Will You Love Me Tomorrow, right? And it just really made that connection that, like, Carole's songs could be sung by anybody and reinterpreted, and they're still so powerful. The emotion of the lyric and the songwriting in there. Yeah, and I think she said, what was it she said in the ceremony? She said something like, people keep telling me that so many songwriters stand on my shoulders. And she said something along the lines of like, now I guess I'm going to have to embrace that, right? And say, but then she turned it around and said, and she wanted to say thank you to all those great artists for interpreting the music and carrying it forward, and sort of thinking how much she loved listening to the music that sort of was inspired by her. That's that cycle that's just so cool to think about in music, because of course every artist is listening to other artists and gets inspired by something new and something different. And you see that in those connections. And I agree with you, Andy, that Jennifer Hudson was just like, she always, like, every time you think she's done the last high note, there's like the band behind her, we should mention, was Adam Blackstone's band, which is just so good. And if people don't know, he's on a ton of award shows with that band and other things. He was the backing band for Justin Timberlake for a while.
Okay.
It was like they took it up even one more key change at the end so she could hit an even higher note at the end. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, it was crazy.
The Tina tribute too, obviously, I mean, having, and I'm a big, her fan. anyway, every time I see her on an award show, you know it's going to be amazing because she can do everything. She's a great guitar player. She's an amazing singer, and she makes it all look easy. And then having her with Keith Urban, I don't think they collaborated before, but like you would never know that. They had such great chemistry. And it's funny because I know that I think Bryan Adams was supposed to be there and wasn't able to be there, but like, you know, it was just like seamless. And I was like, gosh, I remember what a great song. This is such a good song. I'd forgotten about it. You know, and Mickey Guyton, and of course, Christina Aguilera, who like, I love it. She's just like, I'm starting on stage and guess what? I'm just going to kill it because that's, like her confidence was so amazing and hilariously off the charts. It was
agreed.
Awesome.
Yeah, somebody, I saw this written a couple different times, but somebody made the comment that there was going to be a performance, and I forget, you know, who it was, that was going to be the performance that was going to be remembered from this year's inductions in the same way that Prince's performance was. And like whatever they were describing performance wise, like I kind of take that and assign that to hers playing on that cover, It's Only Love, because that guitar work was insane. Like I'm just sitting there watching that, like going, oh my God. So that was a hell of a moment.
Yeah, she's really got like that whole kind of Prince thing going on too, where her voice and her singing is just so good. And then she starts playing guitar and you're like, oh man, so good. Like, you know, it's like she's just she's fantastic. I can't wait to keep seeing what happens next in her career. You know?
And she's 24. She's 24. Oh my God.
Awesome.
All right. So last few things as we look to wrap up here, as we look back a bit in the years since the inductions were first opened to the public here in Cleveland in 2009, what would you two say is like your favorite moment and or performance that comes to mind when you look back at those years past?
That's you ask tough questions.
It's the job.
I've got one that I think because it was early in the inductions being here in Cleveland. I'm forgetting what year when Metallica was inducted.
2009, I believe.
Yeah. Right. So it's early in the inductions here in Cleveland in public auditorium, but there were so many Metallica fans in the audience. And I think that was the first time at an induction ceremony where you heard like a stadium level roar when the band came on to play. And Metallica just came out there and slayed it. I mean, they were just so good. And clearly they put everything into it. Even bringing Jason Newsted back that night to play with them, which, you know, class act, right? Inducted, obviously, Cliff Burton, Jason Newsted, and Robert Trujillo. I thought that was just so cool that they kind of kept the whole family together. That was a really special moment. And I think it showed that, like, oh, yeah, this thing with having fans in the audience, we're going to keep that.
I think of like when Rush was inducted, it was a similar thing. And I think that was when it was in LA. And I just, you know, I honestly, I legitimately watched the Grohl Taylor Hawkins induction speech like at least a couple times a year because it makes me so happy, you know, because it's so funny and personal. But
there was like a little throwback to that this year. Like Dave Grohl, I don't know if you caught it, right? This year when he was like, oh, I'm going to keep this short because usually I'm up here. I'm everywhere talking about rock and roll, blah, 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 rock and roll, blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh, it's a little throwback to the Alex Lifeson speech.
You know, I didn't put the two together, but you're totally right. I just didn't Dave being Dave, you know, because he's all like, you know, I'm done, but that's totally right. That's awesome. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I'm having trouble figuring out which ones were in Cleveland because I watched them all from the Rock Hall because I was thinking, oh, the Nirvana induction I absolutely loved when they had like Lord and St. Vincent. I think that was in New York.
It was at the Barclays Center, but even still, that was one of the ones in the era of like live audience too, right? Which I think again, to your point, Andy, that was such a great night to, you know, think that they brought all those incredible women out to front the band that evening. It just felt so cool.
I will say though, I have two. So when Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, that I believe was in Cleveland. Is that because I was in the press room? That was Dave again. Dave just showed up because Joan was there, you know, because Dave loves to play. I mean, that was just awesome because Joan's fantastic. And, you know, it was everyone was firing on all cylinders. I really like
and they did Crimson and Clover with Tommy James and Miley Cyrus, which was
absolutely
awesome.
And I think that was one of Miley's first kind of, you know, hey, I'm first rock oriented performances too, that everyone was like, you can do you're a little bit more versatile than I think you get credit for.
Yeah.
But I think with Green Day too, and I mean,
Mm.
we got to see they did that mini show at the House of Blues, which was incredible. But then, seeing them play with Ringo, and then, Paul was there, like that was just a really cool moment because, I think again, like Green Day, people might be like, why are they being inducted? They're a punk band or they're a pop punk band. But Billy Joe Armstrong is such a music fan and is just, for all like a student of all kinds of music. And him getting into them getting to play with Ringo was like, a career highlight. And I just remember, and I always appreciate that Paul and Ringo come to Cleveland, because it's a full circle thing. The Beatles played Cleveland twice during their existence. So, they've never forgotten kind of their roots. And so I always really appreciate that.
Yeah, we even got a little Ringo video, up
Yeah.
there too in this one, which was cool.
All right, so here's the bonus question that leads into one of the final questions, Jason. And we did since Metallica just turned 40, we did a Metallica roundtable, one of these videos recently here at UCR. And Annie yelled at me for not telling this story. So I'll use this story as the gateway to get into the question. And that just is 2009, since you mentioned it, Metallica gets inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The night before those inductions, they had a VIP party at the House of Blues here in Cleveland.
Right.
And so I'm out to dinner with a friend of mine who had pledged to bring Jeff Beck with him. He didn't bring Jeff Beck, but as we're wrapping up this dinner, he says, "Hey, I'm going over to the Metallica party at House of Blues. Do you want to come?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So we walk up to the door, and he walks up to the person that is handling the guest list, and he says, "I'm John Zazula, whatever else." And so she looks down the list. Surprisingly, didn't ask him for ID, but looks down the list, finds John Zazula's name on there. And so we're in the door, right? But before we get in the door, then she looks at me and she says, "Well, who's he?" And he just looks right back at her and barks, "That's my plus one." And she thinks about it for a second. She's like, "Okay." So we walk in the door. He walks straight over to John Zazula, which for folks watching this who don't know, John Zazula is the one that is the founder of Megaforce Records that signed Metallica and put out their first 2 records. So he walks straight over to John, gives him a big hug and says, "I just used your name to get in here." And I look to my right and there's Joe Perry, there's Jimmy Page, and just a host of other amazing people. And the night begins. So all those years.
That is a rock and roll story, Matt.
It's a great rock and roll story. So these kind of VIP things that happen each year, like, do you have a favorite kind of VIP moment in that vein from across the years that sticks with you?
Ooh, interesting. I think the fact that now so many bands, by the way, have done that sort of House of Blues gig is so cool because Metallica did it.
Yep.
Green Day did it.
Duff
the Foo Fighters did it this year. I think the fact that not just these kind of VIP moments, but I think almost sometimes at the induction ceremonies, for me, I'm lucky enough to be backstage for a bunch of these. And just even these moments where suddenly, like, you're in the hallway and it's like, there's just this cast of characters back there and they're all talking to each other, but they're kind of just normal people. I almost like those moments more than the whiz bang big VIP moments, because you just like, you see these random people, it's like, suddenly you've got 2 artists you would never think of seeing even in the same room necessarily in our brains. And there they are just talking to each other about their music. Yep. I think that's the cool part, and shows again that it's really all one big family. Like, everybody who makes rock and roll music likes rock and roll music. I mean, you could take, again, LL Cool J or Darryl McDaniels. Like, Darryl McDaniels knows more about the history of rock and roll. That guy's like an encyclopedia. He's just studied everything about it, I think that's those little hidden VIP moments. I will say my favorite one, now I'll show off, in New York when Yes got inducted. And who else was that year? The Zombies and a bunch of other great bands. We had a VIP sort of dinner in New York. And that I was just over the moon, man, because it was one of those parties where, again, you just had all the inductees sort of in the same room at the same time. And I was like, "Kid, what is this? Is this real? Am I dreaming this moment?" It seems, in fact, one of those got written about. I was standing there when, and I didn't even know this was the case until after the fact. John Anderson and John Davidson, who's the current singer of Yes, met each other for the
Wow.
first time at that party
Wow.
when I was standing there. And then I read about it in an article afterwards that they were like, oh, that was a weird introduction to each other. And I was like, well, I could have helped with that. I could have been a better host if I knew it was the first time you guys were ever meeting each other, right?
Yeah. I mean, similar,
So-
Steve Perry and Arnel Pineda, the two Journey guys meeting for the first time.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
a more public and very poignant moment, but like that was a huge moment.
But a really positive one too, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned like the hallway stuff, and I'll just throw this in. Our mutual friend that all three of us know, Wes Orshowski, who did the
Great
Lemmy
guy.
documentary. He was at the Hall of Fame stuff as photographing stuff this year, and he got a shot of one of those hallway moments, which was Paul McCartney and Dave Chappelle just standing there chatting it up, which is cool.
Well, and like, I love that Kathy Valentine tweeted that they met Paul McCartney, and Paul McCartney was like, bassists have to stick together. And like,
Yeah.
oh my God, that's like, as a bassist, and she's such an amazing bassist that like, holy crap, that's totally awesome. Talk about like a vote of confidence, like right there. Not that she needs one, but like, that's just so cool.
Right. Or the fact that she was like blown away by that, right? Because she's
Yeah.
still like, of course, if Paul McCartney says that to you, you're going to be pretty excited no matter who you
Totally.
are.
So so going forward, this is of course is required. We have to ask this. Who do you want to see get the induction nod? So that goes to both of you, whoever wants to field that one first.
I mean, I'll say first that I'm hopeful, and I would love to see Duran Duran get in. When you look at, induction in the Rock Hall, they've been eligible for a while, but when you look at influence and impact and just catalog, I mean, they just put out an amazing new record. It Future Past, and they have like, you look at the history of rock music, they've influenced grunge, they've influenced new metal, they've influenced synth pop, they've influenced Killers and like modern rock, like totally nail it. So I think that finally they're getting that sort of musical affirmation too from people. People are like, yeah, they're pretty good musicians. And so that's probably my number one with a bullet in the coming years.
Annie, I always think the fact that Duran Duran was featured so prominently in Tiger Beat magazine is what's held them back.
I know.
I'm kind of serious about that.
But you know what though? Guess who else was? Van Halen was also prominent in Tiger Beat as Journey.
What?
And all of those
Impossible.
rock bands. And I think even in the 80s, and I've actually studied this because it's fascinating to look at the magazines from that time. But you had like REO Speedwagon, like there were all sorts of rock bands. And so there's definitely, and actually in recent interview, Nick Rhodes, I think even mentioned the whole Tiger Beat thing. So I'm like, if Eddie can be a pinup, and then obviously Duran Duran can. So, but I think you're right. I think people see them as pretty faces.
Yeah.
Don't realize what music fans they are and what monster players they are too.
Monster players. We were even talking about the connection back to bands like Roxy Music, or another one of my obscure favorites, the band Japan. And you think of Duran Duran in that same group of those bands. Such good music.
Such good music.
One of the ones I think that's high on my list that I would love to see inducted, not to make this an Annie and Jason Love the 80s festival here, but and I have a theory of how I'd like to see this done. We'll see if it ever happens. And I'm using the induction of the Faces, Small Faces here as my model. I'm going for a singular induction for Joy Division New Order.
Interesting.
Because I think you could do that, right? Because they're really almost the same band, right? And I just think New Order is so influential. And now that we've opened up with some, Kraftwerk and Depeche Mode, I'd really love, because I also think there's no good goth band in here. I could argue for Bauhaus too, right? But I think New Order and Joy Division, you kind of get both that way that punk went into post-punk and goth and then into synth pop. You got a whole story that time period with those guys, which would be great. And even from that same era, I'd love to see Susie and the Banshees inducted someday too. I think that'd be another really great one.
And, I think with the Cure getting in too, and then, Depeche Mode as well, that really does kind of like open the doors a little bit, because all of those bands were so huge in the US too.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
sometimes in, British bands, don't, they're like, oh, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think
Yeah.
it's become a little bit more well-known now, but my God, New Order headlined, a festival here, but they still
Yeah.
headline massive venues here. And Joy Division, I think even if they had only done Love Will Tear Us Apart, they would still be influential, but there was just so much more. And even now there's so many young bands that still sound like them.
Yeah.
I really like that. I think that is, I've never considered that before. And I like that idea. Now it's percolated in my head. I appreciate that.
All right, we got some energy going.
Exactly. All right, who's nominating committee? And I should say I have no power at all. I always tell people, they're like, talk about this. I'm like, look, I got no power. If someone wants to give me power, awesome. But right now, all I have is pontification.
But Matt, you and I have talked about this. I'd love to see Maiden inducted, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I voted for Maiden. I voted for Judas Priest.
Yep.
A Motorhead would be awesome to get Lemmy in. It's I would have wished we would have done it when he was alive, but it'd still be great to get Motorhead in. And there's even some other weird ones, like on the early influences, literal early influences.
Yeah.
I'd still love to see Big Mama Thornton inducted, who's not inducted.
She's not inducted. Really?
Right? Isn't that crazy? Right?
Wow.
So I keep talking about her, or even some more obscure ones like Thomas Dorsey, who's the father of modern gospel. I'd love to see some names like that. And, I want to keep moving forward, but I think there's a few other ones that would be cool to pick in some of the earlier time periods too, as we think about influence. And then King Crimson, on the prog side, I think they're probably too wild to get the votes, but they deserve to be in just for the musicianship there alone too.
I don't know. I think if you put Kraftwerk in, I think you can put in King Crimson.
Yeah, you might have to someday do it a similar way, with an influence award. But I think King Crimson is just, I saw them when they played here in Cleveland again recently, just like rekindled my love for how insane that band is. They're so good.
Now I should know this. Is Frank Zappa in the Rock Hall?
Yep.
Okay, if Frank Zappa can get in the Rock Hall,
right, then we should be able to put King Crimson in.
Exactly.
We're going to exercise the Zappa clause.
I like that, man. I think I'm going to steal that one. That's good.
Zappa clause.
Now, I keep writing it in and it keeps getting scratched out. And for some reason, Duran Duran keeps getting written in. And I do understand it. But after Duran Duran gets inducted, we have to find a way to get Warren Zevon in.
Oh.
Yeah. His name comes up a lot. You'd be surprised at the museum. We have that Voice Your Choice tally board. And Warren Zevon gets mentioned in there quite a bit. I think he's sort of in that same, don't you think he's sort of similar almost even to the Todd Rundgren induction this year? Fits in that category, right?
Very similar in the way that, honestly, Jason, I think that, and maybe some of this is finally starting to thaw away, but this is just completely hypothetical. I think it's safe to say, based on what we know about Warren Zevon, I think he made some enemies during his years in the music industry with his unique personality that have maybe kind of kept the doors a little more tightly locked. But I think we've seen that fall away with other similar artists and bands that maybe made some enemies across the years that are now in, because it's just as people shuffle in and out, those old grudges kind of go with them. So
yeah, I would agree entirely. I think that's right.
So as we wrap up here, what is kind of coming up at the Rock Hall that you're kind of excited about?
I think I'm excited. Just, this year was an interesting one where we kind of came out of the pandemic. We had a great Rock Hall Live, our summer concert series with some great local bands and some other folks. I'm excited to move into the next calendar year. Hopefully, at this point where we are here at the end of 2021, things continue to improve. And we, see a real bunch of people coming to the museum. And then the other thing I'm excited about just for the next several years is the expansion we're putting at the Rock Hall. And for anybody who was at that Go-Go's LL Cool J event at the Rock Hall on the Friday before inductions, we were packed in there. It's a hard museum to move people around. We're planning this beautiful expansion that's going to go between us and where the Great Lakes Science Center is now on the lakefront. So we're going to have this beautiful new expanded building, hopefully with more space to hold larger events, increase some of our classroom size for education programs, even hopefully get some redo of the exhibit galleries and expand some of that. So I think the Rock Hall's, I know obviously I work there, so I'm biased, but I think we're on a real roll. I think it's exciting. There's a lot of new artists getting inducted. And I think the future is really bright. There's going to be some really exciting things coming soon too.
Well, I think fans would appreciate this. You said something as we were emailing back and forth that I really love. And you just said, I try to find some time every few weeks to walk around the galleries, not as the VP, but as a fan, and just enjoy the artifacts and history and let it all wash over me. It's important not to forget that's why I'm here in the first place. And I think that, anybody that has just watched this, like, I mean, you kind of, underlined it with the last few things you said, but it's like your passion for what you do comes through. So, you don't even have to justify it in the way that you kind of did here and there, but they're lucky to have you in the slot, man. You're a positive part of that whole organization. So I'll just say
thank you guys.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks for coming on to kind of talk some tunes. I know it doesn't take too much arm twisting to get you to talk music, and especially prog. We did some of that, but I appreciate your time. Time is valuable.
Yeah, thank you guys. I always appreciate talking to both of you too, because it's so much fun. And people should know we occasionally have conversations that aren't filmed, and just love talking about rock and roll. So thanks for having me on, guys.